You remember the 1980s as the decade of neon colors, giant hair, cassette tapes, arcades, and MTV. At least, that's what your brain tells you. But here's the strange part. A surprising number of the things we all think of as pure 80s either started years earlier, didn't arrive until the 90s, or never looked quite the way pop culture remembers them. If you've ever caught yourself saying, "That was definitely an 80s thing," there's a pretty good chance your memory has been doing a little creative editing. And honestly, that's normal. The late 70s quietly spilled into the early 80s. The late 80s kept hanging around well into the early 90s. Culture rarely wakes up on January 1st and announces, "New decade, everyone. Please update your hairstyles." Instead, trends fade in, overlap, and sometimes refuse to leave at all. Today, we're separating nostalgia from reality and looking at some of the biggest 80s memories that weren't quite as 80s as most of us remember. Let's rewind. On August 1st, 1981, MTV launched, and the very first music video they aired was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Buggles. That moment became television history. But here's the twist. The song itself wasn't an 80s song. It was recorded in 1978 and released in September 1979, months before the new decade even began. By the time MTV introduced millions of Americans to it, the single had already climbed to #1 in several countries. In other words, MTV didn't launch the song. The song helped launch MTV. The video belonged to the 80s. The song was one of the last great pop records of the 70s. Kind of like showing up fashionably late to a party and somehow becoming the guest everyone remembers. Ask almost anyone to name the most iconic gadget of the 1980s. Odds are, the Sony Walkman makes the list. It completely changed how people listen to music. For the first time, your soundtrack could go wherever you went. Except Sony introduced the very first Walkman in Japan in July 1979. Technically, the biggest symbol of portable 80s culture was already sitting on store shelves before the decade officially arrived. Now, to be fair, most people outside of Japan didn't get one until 1980, and the Walkman absolutely exploded throughout the decade. The same thing happened with cassette tapes themselves. While the cassette was invented back in 1963, it took nearly 2 decades before the Walkman transformed it from a recording format into a lifestyle. If Hollywood recreated the 1980s based on Instagram, every house would have glowing pink walls, turquoise furniture, and enough fluorescent clothing to guide airplanes. Reality looked considerably browner. Walk into the average suburban home in 1982, and you were much more likely to find wood paneling, beige carpeting, harvest gold appliances, and floral wallpaper. The famous neon aesthetic absolutely existed, but it lived mostly in places designed to grab your attention: music videos, shopping malls, arcades, aerobics classes, advertising, nightclubs. Those became the images burned into our collective memory because they were exciting. Nobody makes nostalgic documentaries about beige carpeting. You know the haircut. Business in the front, party in the back. Love it or laugh at it, it's become one of the defining images of the 1980s. But here's the part that surprises a lot of people. The hairstyle was everywhere in the 80s. The name wasn't. Plenty of celebrities wore the look. Athletes, rock stars, actors. You saw variations of the haircut all over television and magazine covers. But if you walked into a barbershop in 1986 and confidently said, "Give me a mullet," you'd probably get a confused look. The term didn't become widely popular until the mid-1990s, after the Beastie Boys released their song "Mullet Head." The hairstyle became famous first. The punchline came years later. Here's one that short-circuits a lot of people's memories. Home Alone has everything we associate with late 80s family films. A script by John Hughes, a warm suburban setting, practical effects, memorable one-liners, and a soundtrack by John Williams. Except, Home Alone wasn't released in the 1980s. It arrived in theaters in November 1990. Technically, it belongs to the same decade as Toy Story, Jurassic Park, and Pulp Fiction. So why does it feel so unmistakably 80s? Because culture doesn't flip a switch when the calendar changes. The fashions, the architecture, the family comedies, even the way movies were filmed, didn't suddenly transform on January 1st, 1990. Our brains remember Home Alone as an 80s movie because emotionally, it kind of feels like one. Sometimes nostalgia files things by vibe instead of by date. We're about halfway through, and if you're realizing your memory has quietly merged 2 entire decades together, you're definitely not alone. What's one movie, song, or trend you were absolutely convinced belonged to a different decade? Tell us in the comments. And if you're enjoying separating nostalgia from reality, don't forget to subscribe. Ask someone to name hip-hop's biggest era, and many people immediately start listing 90s legends: Tupac, the Notorious B.I.G., Nas, Wu-Tang Clan. Those artists absolutely helped define the decade. But by the time they arrived, hip-hop had already spent years building its foundation. Artists like the Sugar Hill Gang, Run DMC, and the Beastie Boys helped push the genre into the mainstream during the mid-1980s. By the time the 1990s arrived, hip-hop wasn't an underground experiment anymore. It was already reshaping popular music. It's another reminder that cultural revolutions spend years gathering momentum before the rest of the world notices. When people think about the end of the Cold War, many memories blend together: the collapse of the Soviet Union, the changing map of Europe, the beginning of a new political era. Because so much happened in the early 1990s, it's easy to assume the fall of the Berlin Wall happened then too. It didn't. The wall came down on November 9th, 1989, just 7 weeks before the decade ended. In other words, one of history's most famous symbols disappeared while the 80s were still technically on the calendar. July 12, 1979 was Disco Demolition Night at Chicago's Comiskey Park, where thousands of disco records were blown up between games of a baseball doubleheader. It's become one of the most famous moments in music history, almost like someone flipped a switch and declared, "Disco is officially over." Except, music rarely works that way. Listen to Blondie's Call Me, which topped the charts in 1980, or Lips Inc.'s Funky Town, Kool and the Gang's Celebration, Diana Ross's I'm Coming Out. You'll hear the same danceable rhythms, lush production, and infectious grooves that helped define disco. Only now they were being marketed as dance pop, post-disco, funk, or simply pop music. Even artists who wanted nothing to do with the word disco borrowed many of its musical ideas. In other words, disco didn't vanish. It got a makeover. Ask someone to picture an 80s hairstyle. Chances are they're imagining enough hairspray to punch a hole in the ozone layer. But here's the thing, that wasn't the entire decade. The truly enormous hairstyles most of us associate with the decade really took off around the middle of the 80s, reaching their peak somewhere between 1985 and 1988. By the time the early 1990s rolled around, many styles were already becoming sleeker and less dramatic. So the most iconic 80s hair actually dominated for only a few years. Once again, nostalgia tends to remember the loudest version of a decade, not necessarily the most common one, which makes sense. Nobody remembers the perfectly average haircut. Here's one that surprises almost everyone. Ask people when the internet began, and most answers land somewhere in the 1990s. After all, that's when many of us first logged on. The World Wide Web arrived in 1991. Then came websites, search engines, email, online shopping. But the internet itself is older than that. On January 1st, 1983, a network called ARPANET officially adopted the TCP/IP communication standard, the foundation that still powers the modern internet today. Even before that, researchers have been connecting computers for years. Regular people were getting online during the 1980s too, although it looked very different from what we know today. The internet didn't suddenly appear in the 90s. The 90s simply gave it a friendlier face, and thankfully, much faster loading times. So, what does all of this tell us? Maybe the biggest myth about decades is that they have clear beginnings and endings. That's why nostalgia can be so wonderfully confusing. When we remember a decade, we're not remembering a timeline. We're remembering birthdays, summer vacations, Saturday morning cartoons, family road trips. Our brains don't file those memories under neat little labels like 1988 or 1991. They file them under how they made us feel. Maybe that's why so many of these memories end up borrowing pieces from different decades. Because nostalgia isn't really about getting every date exactly right. It's about remembering the moments that stayed with us long after the calendar page turned. If today's trip down memory lane uncovered a few surprises, let us know which one caught you completely off guard. And if you enjoy exploring the stories behind the memories, be sure to subscribe to Nostalgia Area. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay nostalgic.